Well, the Democrats are licking their wounds as the scale of their defeat in the US elections continues to sink in. Tim, you were speaking to students and academics yesterday at the University of London. How did it go? Were you brilliant? And what did they say back to you?
Well, I wasted 5 minutes trying to get the slideshow to work, of course. But once I had managed that, I mean, one thing I was trying to address in the talk is there's now going to be a big what if hanging over the 2024 election, which is what if Joe Biden had stayed in? And supporters of Joe, which probably amounts to his wife Jill, will say, look, this is the one man in history who has beaten Donald Trump. He had a good economy behind him, a solid progressive record. Okay, so he had one bad debate, but he was basically forced out by a coup. An unpopular candidate replaced him, and what a surprise, she lost. So there will now a counterfactual begin to emerge that says Joe Biden could have won this thing. And what I stressed in my talk yesterday is that if you look at the polling, there's really no evidence to suggest that Joe Biden had bad approval ratings through much of his time in office, that he was falling behind Trump in the polls by late 2023. That's 6 months before the infamous debate. There was already talk about his ill health. And by the time of the debate, he spent 28 days afterwards deciding whether or not to stay in, trying to fight it, which did even more damage, with the result that when he finally pulled out, poor old Kamala Harris, who I do think is the victim in all of this, was forced to take over a party to inherit someone else's structure, someone else's record, with only 3 months left to sell herself to the public. Plus, she couldn't make a break from the Biden administration and say, here's what he got wrong and here's what I would do right. So I think there's a very good case for saying that Biden really did his party and his ticket a great deal of harm. Plus, there's something about the mystery of the election is why, when the American economy has been performing so well in terms of numbers, do Americans have a poor perception of it? And I do think, this is hard to prove, but I suspect that people in their minds came to link their perception of America's poor performance with Joe Biden's health. There was something actually about seeing this old decaying man on your TV every day that just reminded them of the suffering of COVID of the last few years and this feeling that America was going backwards and not moving forwards. So I concluded by saying I think Biden did more harm than good. The other thing that's worth pointing out is people will also ask, was this another misogyny election? Is the fact that when Americans were asked to choose between two women, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, on both occasions they went with Donald Trump, even though the polls showed that people had a very bad opinion of Donald Trump. Well, that may well be true, but I would point out that this could also be an anti-Tim factor, because Hillary Clinton ran with her vice presidential candidate, a man called Tim Kaine. Kamala Harris ran with someone called Tim Walz. So on the two occasions that Americans were asked to choose between Trump and a Tim, they chose Trump.
I thought you were talking about an anti-Tim Stanley election. I say this is absolutely outrageous and needs to be investigated.
I think the last 8 years have demonstrated beyond doubt people's profound underlying prejudice against men called Tim.
Thoughts and prayers with you, Tim, for that. And I don't want to hear any more of that seditious talk. That's a really fascinating insight into Biden's ill health, reflecting the notional ill health of America.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
you made a great point in our discussions before we came onto the podcast about the beaming Bidens, Joe and Jill, when they met President-elect Trump. Just take me through how you analyze that meeting.
It's very different to when Trump met Obama in 2016.
That was a prickly. I remember watching
very
that.
Frosty.
Very frosty, prickly meeting.
I was there, not
Obama
in the room, but
look at him.
I was visiting the White House and the press office when all that happened. I met Obama's dog. Yeah, it was very, which I think reflects how different things are on 8 years, that people are more used to Trump as a quantity and as a character. But also it's hard not to read into that, into the Bidens, the welcome they showed him, some sense of vindication. They will be thinking, well, the Democratic Party did this to itself. And also, you know what? Jill and Joe are old white Catholics. They are Trump's core vote. They might not have voted for him, but that's his demographic.
Remember that awful picture of Biden going into the polling booth and he was in there for ages? Maybe he was having a crisis of confidence and he couldn't quite put his pen down by Kamala Harris because he really instinctively wanted to vote for Donald Trump. I think it's slightly delusional to think if the Democrats had changed the candidate, they would have somehow won. I think that Biden, there was obviously, firstly, the capability issue. Could he actually have continued as president? Period. There's that point. But also, I think it covers up the real need the Democrats have for root and branch change in what is their message to the American public. It's not about people. Kamala Harris wasn't a very strong candidate, but the root causes of their loss is down to what might be described as the liberal narrative that huge numbers of the public have just rejected. And I think I would add to your idea of the sickness of the country, inflation and prices. If you're feeling worse off at the end of the year compared with the beginning of the year, you will blame the government. And the incumbent was the Democrats. But let's continue that conversation about what next for the Democrats. Someone who is in the front line of can they ever rebuild, and if they do rebuild, what should that look like, is Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey. Always seen as a safe blue state, but actually Trump came within 5 percentage points of winning it last week. Absolutely astonishing how many of these city areas or city-dominated areas did move significantly towards Trump. He didn't quite get over the line, of course, in New Jersey, but it was an incredible phenomenon, this collapse in Democratic support and particularly the changing voting patterns in Latino communities. So Gordon Rayner and I actually caught up with Governor Murphy at the end of last week and asked him, why did Kamala Harris lose?
I don't know that there's a crisp answer I've got for you guys. I think it's probably a variety of reasons. President Trump played the immigration card, the inflation economic security card, the crime card, regardless of what the facts are. And in many cases, they're at odds with his claims, but he played all of those really well. Identity politics, he played really well. I think it's fair to say that she was deeply connected, as obviously the case, to the Biden-Harris record, and President Biden, notwithstanding the fact I think he's done a great job, has got pretty weak numbers, and not being able to break from that probably hurt. I can tell you it wasn't money. She raised a ton of money. They both did, but I don't see that. A lot of people sat in their hands. It's plus or minus, he got the same amount of votes that he got in 2020, and she got a lot less than Biden got in 2020. And again, is it the message? Is it the messenger? Is it policies breaking from the past or not? The other guy playing a hand brilliantly. Underestimating Donald Trump usually means you lose, and he's proven that again.
Do you think Joe Biden should have stood down sooner than he did to give Kamala Harris a longer sort of run-up to it? And also a question I'm always really interested in, do you think Biden should have stood down as president so that she could have been president for a few months? Would that have helped?
Yeah, on the first one, in a perfect world, I think the answer has to be yes, because she had such a short runway to introduce herself, notwithstanding she had run for president, was vice president, was a senator. There's nothing like running for president and introducing yourself. So in a perfect world, I think yes, on the first question, a longer runway would have helped. I'm not convinced if he had stepped down. First of all, there was no likelihood of that happening, period, based on every data point that I have. But I'm not sure it would have helped, even if I'm wrong about his willingness to do so.
The story of the evening has been portrayed as the Democrats taking a lot of what might be described as their base for granted, particularly amongst Latino demographics. Do you think the Latino demographic, do you think that's a fair accusation to lay at the door of Kamala Harris's campaign?
You'd have to say at least to some extent, yes. But I also think we're probably underestimating those cards that Trump played so well, I mentioned up front, that those were impacting black and brown votes as well as non-black and brown votes. I think it's a mistake to just assume only a certain group cares about immigration, or only a certain group cares about whatever your policy issue might be. But the answer, at least to some extent, has to be that their concerns were misunderstood, were not taken seriously. I'm proud to say I've been elected twice. We carried the black vote 94-6 twice. And so I know, at least in New Jersey, I know what that playbook looks like, and it's caring about people and listening to them. It begins with that for sure.
If you look at the New Jersey numbers, it's interesting, that point you've just made, which I'd like to just dig into a little more. But just to look at the New Jersey numbers, in 2020, voters rejected Trump by a 16-point margin. Last week, it was only 5 points. So although, as you say, you were able to still retain the support of what might be sometimes described as your natural supporters, clearly there was a bigger, broader shift.
Yeah, and my reference was to my race, or my two races, I should say. No question, your numbers are exactly right. You've got about 11-point shift in margin. By the way, almost identical to the shift we saw in New York, Maryland, Illinois, and California. And what do those 5 states, including ourselves, have in common? We're pretty big blue bastions. And even within the big blue bastions, the margins shrunk literally in all of those states, including Jersey, somewhere between 10 and 12%. Pretty shocking.
And why?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of a lot of the reasons we discussed up front. I don't think there's one magic bullet answer here. It's probably partly taking people for granted. It's the kitchen table, inflation, affordability, probably some post-COVID. You remember the movie Network and the guy's leaning out the window, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. There's a lot more of that than I think people appreciated. People are really, 60% of the country, plus or minus, is screaming out. And I think if you stay as deeply connected to the Biden-Harris administration, I give her a lot of credit for her loyalty, by the way, pretty remarkable. But if the mood is what I'm describing and you're hitching yourself completely, I mean, she was given an opportunity on several occasions to say, to answer the question, what would you have done differently, or any mistakes, to say 100% cemented with an administration at a time when people are hurting, probably explains a big amount of that shift.
Governor, you worked with Donald Trump for 3 years during his first term. You've stayed in touch with the Trump camp. You've said since the election that, I think you said, if there is common ground to be found, we will be incredibly aggressive to try and find that common ground. So what common ground do you think there is with Trump?
Yeah, so the history, you're absolutely right. I was governor for my first 3 years when Donald Trump was president. We fought him like heck, by the way, guys. We fought him morning, noon, and night. But it shifted almost overnight in February of 2020 with COVID. And you probably recall that New York City and northern New Jersey were the first parts of the U.S. to get crushed in that first wave. And we had nowhere else to turn. And he and his team were incredibly helpful to us. And together we saved a lot of lives. We lost a lot, but it would have been a lot worse. We then got to know each other. Visited him in the Oval Office. We had dinner together in New Jersey. He spends usually 4 to 5 months a year in New Jersey, is one of his homes. We found common ground on a big infrastructure project. So I can't predict yet what it will be. My guess is he's a big infrastructure guy. He's obviously a real estate guy. So I would bet that would be an area that we would find common cause, but probably too early to tell you definitively.
Is the caricature, just given what you've just said about his work and his team's work through those pretty dark days, is the caricature of Donald Trump as a blowhard, racist, misogynistic person who has no real moral values, doesn't really have a political philosophy, bends with the wind, is deliberately controversial, makes things up. Is that not a fair characterization of him?
Listen, while I know him and have found common ground, I don't know him intimately for sure. I would make one observation, though, in answering that. I do find the public Donald Trump, in my experience at least, different than the private Donald Trump. We went to see him after he was shot in, when was that, July of this year, in Bedminster, where, as I mentioned, in New Jersey, one of his homes. And it was almost devoid of politics. It was purely to give the guy a hug, having almost got his head blown off. And it's just a very different guy than the one you see on the campaign trail, where he says some stuff which are just beyond outrageous. That's not been my private experience.
Governor, you're on an economic mission to Britain at the moment, aren't you, to strengthen ties between Britain and New Jersey? Obviously, UK-US relations or UK-Trump relations aren't brilliant at the moment. Trump's team took legal action against the Labour Party here for sending people over to campaign for Kamala Harris. He's not exactly aligned with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. Are you worried about what a UK-US relationship is going to look like under Trump?
First of all, you're absolutely right. We already have a great two-way trade and investment and job creation with the UK, and we're over here to build on that. And we're both big innovation economy players. Jersey is a big pharmaceutical, bio, life science, tech, telecom, movies and TV, like a lot of what England has. So we're in the middle of it and really enjoying both London and Cambridge. I actually think there's opportunity. I know that may sound a little bit off, and Keir Starmer's in the Labour Party. But listen, I'm a progressive Democrat, and I've been able to find common cause. Again, you balance finding common cause with fighting like hell to protect people's interests, values, etc. I'm not a pessimist. I mentioned to some folks yesterday, I could even see a little bit of, you guys made the decision to leave the EU, bold, radical decision, leaving. I'm overstating this, by the way. I was not a supporter of Brexit. I should just say that clearly. But you made a really tough decision to leave this big bureaucratic blob. I'm a guy who makes really tough, bold decisions, even if it's against people's expectation. I could see that. I'm not speaking for the president for sure, but I could see that being the case.
What lessons, Governor Murphy, from the election for maybe not only the Democrats, but for what movements that might describe themselves as left or progressive? Because we've seen this story before where liberal left-leaning parties, incumbents, governments are turfed out because they appear not to be able to engage with working class people who are most concerned, as you said, with prices, with the day-to-day effort to make ends meet. So what lessons for you? And maybe thinking over here, because what we've had here, Governor Murphy, is Labour government came in, not with a huge amount of support, but with a very big majority. And what we've seen since they've been in power, 140 days or so, is the polls have moved against them very, very aggressively. So I think there is an underlying trend problem here where lots of people are arguing that Donald Trump has managed to fashion a political offer, particularly to the working classes, which is undermining and undercutting the left's ability to speak to them and to get their support.
Yeah, that's a good question. By the way, I've been in London a lot. My wife lived here. Her mother was born here. This is a city we know well. But one data point that is extremely misunderstood by Americans is drawing a conclusion based on the amount of representatives you have in the House of Commons. And folks sort of walk away looking at that number thinking Labor's in an 80-20 favorability position when in fact that's far from the actual case. Listen, this is, first of all, any self-respecting Democrat has to look long and hard in the mirror, has to really boil this down, has to come to grips and understand the reasons we got what we got on Tuesday. And we've talked about some of them. Are those long-term trends? I don't know, because we were up against the guy who I think is, by any measure, a unique individual. He has an ability, a world-class ability to tap into grievance, to tap into a sort of nativism. And he did it in a way that was, remarkable. I'm not sure. So that we've got to separate, I'm a former banker, and they talk about in the market, a particular stock has systematic risk and unsystematic risk. Systematic risk is the whole market moves. Unsystematic risk is your company, your particular stock. Democrats have to do a really thorough and good job of separating what was systematic versus unsystematic, Donald Trump being the unsystematic element here. But there are clearly lessons to be learned, including taking certain big blocks or communities for granted. I think the immigration reality was completely underestimated. Even when they had the facts on their side, the story was not told. And I think that was that and inflation and just sort of a drag in the economy. Ironically, while the top line numbers have gotten a lot better, and there's millions of jobs that were created during the Biden-Harris years, the fact of the matter is that wasn't the gut, that wasn't the sort of visceral sense of the American voter, and Donald Trump leaned into that and exploited it brilliantly.
Governor, you said just now you're an optimist. Should we in the UK be optimistic about the chance of a trade deal with the US, or should we be pessimistic about the possibility of tariffs on UK goods, which could prove a problem for us?
I think if the one thing that unites Democrats and Republicans, whether we like to admit it or not, is the People's Republic of China. So I think if you were China, it's going to be tough medicine on the tariff front, if I had to predict. And the other thing we have to observe, I did not do this, and I'm proud of it, but a lot of people run for office and say things to get elected, as opposed to saying things that they actually think they will put in place. So there's the sort of the bluster end of the spectrum and the actual, I'm going to govern this way, end of the spectrum. I don't know about a broader tariff program. I would bet against it. But I think one suggestion for the folks who are watching us or listening to us is let's look at the team that he assembles, and you'll start to see names over the next couple of weeks, and certainly you'll have a very good sense of it by Christmas. Let's see what names are on that list and look at what they stand for. And I think that'll give us a much more precise sense of whether or not a trade deal is likely, or the other end of the spectrum, that tariffs are going to be coming more broadly than with the People's Republic of China. I think it's too early to tell on either right now. Again, I'm probably in the minority. I think there's sort of a side door opportunity for the UK, given my prior rant about his seeing the move to leave the European Union, which I think was a disastrous move. But I think he might see it as, those guys did something really courageous. I might be willing to do business with them.
Governor Murphy, thank you so much for that analysis of what went wrong for the Democrats. Very honest. Thank you for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you so much for having us. Let's do this in New Jersey next time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Some very interesting points there about what it's like to deal with Donald Trump in private, away from the cameras, because we're used to, as you have put it, Kamal, panto Trump. But actually, in private, you can get serious. You can get serious Trump, who's a fixer, who's just interested in making things happen. And also interesting to hear that he may have a positive attitude towards Britain still because of Brexit. And I do think we tend to see Trump from our perspective, and we sort of think, how does he think about us? But the reality is he doesn't think about us very much at all. Countries are dealt with in shorthand. China is big threat. Russia is war with Britain. And what is Britain to him? Britain is Brexit. Even though we don't, of course, have a Brexit government, one is hoping that he's still well disposed towards us because he sees us as being generally part of his great populist revolution.
And also, he can send a signal to the European Union that, hey, I can deal with the UK because they don't have these ludicrous rules that you have, Mr. Protectionist EU.
Yeah.
And it sends a signal. And actually, if Keir Starmer is smart, and that's a big if, he can ride that wave. And let's see how he gets on.